Hi, good morning. Hey, RIISE. It's been a minute since we've had lunch with Gina, so thanks for joining me today. We have some really exciting things to talk about. We are joined today by a guest speaker who is, I'm very proud to call one of our newer member schools, an administrator at Tabor Academy in Massachusetts. And we have Anika Walker-Johnson with us, who is the Dean of Multicultural Studies. Make sure I got that right, because you have double title, Dean of Multicultural Studies, as well as Associate Dean, Associate Director of Admissions at Tabor, correct?
Yes, well, Associate Dean of Multicultural Education and Community Life.
So. Community life, yeah, that community life is really important. And we'll talk more about what that community life means in a moment. But again, I want to thank you for joining us today, because we are at a pivotal point for many of our families with the admissions process. And that is the interview. And RIISE has been really helpful and supportive with families with regards to doing some mock interviews with some students. But we wanted to hear directly from the expert what it is that can really make a great first impression. And not only a great first impression, but a lasting impression to really support the admissions process. So I have a few questions for you, but before I get started, I do want to thank folks for downloading the book. I'm so excited about it. The RIISE Roadmap to Independent School Success and Beyond. Its first installment, as you know, is available for download. And the first installment is how this unique educational journey can benefit families of color. So thanks for reading it, for sharing it. We're looking forward to the second installment, where we are talking more about the admissions process itself, the apps, the interview, testing, how do we show up and create an opportunity where we can have as much success with a whole lot of luck as possible. And we are also, this Wednesday, the 28th of October, doing our second RIISE Roadmap workshop series. Again, we're going to be talking about things like the interview process and testing. So please join us if you're at that stage of the game with the admissions process, the application itself, and it's going to be hosted by Riverdale Country School. So go on the website, forriise.org, that's for RIISE.org, and there you will find information about Wednesday's event under events. All right, so let's get started. So, Anika, let's see, where should we start? So as you sit in your role, in your admissions role at Tabor, what is the most important thing you want to understand about the student who's applying to your boarding school?
I would say that there are a couple of things that I believe is really important to know about a student who's applying. One, I believe that we want to know in what ways does the student envision Tabor Academy or boarding school in general as being an integral part of their continued growth on their educational journeys. And the second piece to that is in what ways do they envision being a part of the community beyond the classroom? What strengths do they envision bringing to the table beyond their academic strengths?
And this could very well be an extension of their essay, right? When, if you have their essay beforehand, they might be, sharing some of that information already, and this might be an opportunity for you to see how their person-to-person communication skills are. They may have written this out already, but what are you saying when we're in front of one another?
So for sure, if there's any information that's submitted prior to the interview, I use that as a part of my line of questioning. If I only have sort of minimal information, demographic information, for example, and maybe some notes about what extracurricular activities they're interested in, then I'll redesign my questions so that I'm able to pull out that information that I just mentioned before.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that this information that you find most valuable might be something that most schools, most admissions directors kind of want to know about a student? How do you feel like you're going to fit into our community, and how are you going to interact even outside of the classroom? Would you say most schools want to know that?
I believe so. Obviously, every school is different in terms of their school culture, but I do believe we want to know those same things. Part of an admissions person's job is to help build the community surrounding the values instilled in the mission of each particular school. So whether that's a day school or a boarding school, you're still building community, and part of building community is bringing together lots of different folks onto campus. So certainly, I think that you have a limited amount of time that you spend in the classroom. The rest of the time outside the classroom is equally important to building that school community.
I agree. So, in what ways do you assess this information? I guess, can you give us examples of some of the questions that you might ask to find out, why the school might be a good fit for a student, or how they can contribute to the school even outside of the classroom? What kind of questions would you ask to prompt the responses you're looking for?
So one question, which might seem a little bit like it's focused more on the classroom, but it actually speaks a lot about the kind of student or person that the student is I will often ask if your teachers were providing information in this interview about you, what kind of qualities would they say that you exhibit in the classroom? So are you able to work well with others? Are you an integral part of the class conversation, but do you also allow other voices to be heard? Are you willing to take risks, ask questions about things that are confusing to you, or perhaps even to challenge in a respectful way an idea that you don't necessarily agree with? Those are all qualities that transfer outside the classroom into the school community. A second question that I might ask is about family values. What are the family values that are most important to you? Family values, it's not, I ask that question not as a judgment on the family's values, but I ask that as a means of understanding where the student is coming from and why they might behave the way that they do, why they might respond to certain situations the way that they do. If trust, for example, is a really important value to that student, and then certainly building relationships of trust across multiple lines, whether it's with teachers, advisors, with classmates, and so forth, that really will give you a clue as to why a student is not sure how to finish that statement, why a student responds the way that they do.
Yeah, we talk a lot about that with RIISE, for families understanding their values, and being able to express that. That's what's going to really determine how successful a family is, not only getting into an independent school, but also being enrolled in an independent school. We want to keep our family values. Because that is part of who we are. It grounds us, it supports us, not only academically, but emotionally and socially as well.
And
That's great.
it's a partnership for sure. Schools don't seek to exclude parents from the educational process. You know, parents are as much of a part of the team as the teachers or administrators or even the student, him or herself.
Yeah, no, I'm a witness. I'm big on partnerships with my school in particular and a lot of our member schools. So I think that's something that parents, well, let's talk about that too then. So what role does the parent, I know last night we had a moment to talk prior to this. And so again, it's the parents who are coming to me and saying, can we do a mock interview with my child? And I think that's great. We should be prepared. But to what extent is the parent kind of removed from this interview process with the student? How much do you want them to participate, and can you tell when students have kind of like been prompted really hard by parents?
Well, every school's approach to the admissions process, the interview process in particular, may be slightly different. For us, we interview the parents and the students separately. And what this allows us to do is to really get the student to be able to relax without prompting from the parent, to be able to be as candid as they would like. And what that also allows us to do is when we're meeting together with parents, what I often discover is that students won't often brag about themselves. They're uncomfortable with saying, well, I'm student government president and I'm a part of this particular club, unless you ask questions that pull that information out. However, parents are all too happy to brag about their children. So it's a good opportunity to be able to connect the dots and fill in the gaps that students don't fill in for themselves. I would say that interviewing them separately also gives you the opportunity to make sure that a parent's conversation doesn't overtake the student's conversation. Ultimately, it's the student that's going to be on campus. And for as much as the parent wants to help in that process, I think that interviewing them separately is actually more productive, both for the student and for the school.
So that being the case, as in most schools, again, the parents are interviewed separately, if at all, right? But definitely the students are being interviewed. Let's talk about when that interview process actually starts. It doesn't start once that student walks into your office.
That's correct.
It starts from the time that student comes on campus.
For sure, for sure. There are lots of people who are, first of all, people are interested in visitors all the time. Students are interested in visitors, staff, faculty. They're interested in who's coming to campus. Certainly, if they know that they're going to be interviewing, they're already beginning to wonder where this person may fit in within the community. So from the moment they walk into the office and interact with the administrative assistant, they're already in some ways being evaluated. The interactions that they have with other people in the waiting room, whether it's coaches or other parents, other students, when they're walking on the tour, certainly that's another. The student themselves is not necessarily evaluating the parents, but they're certainly paying attention to whether or not a student asked questions, whether or not they seemed friendly. They may even comment, this particular student was really shy and it was kind of hard to get them engaged in conversation. And it doesn't necessarily mean that some of that commentary will count against the student, but it certainly provides a fuller picture of who the student and who the parents are as a result of these other spaces that are separate from the interview office.
Yeah. So talking about tours, interesting story. My daughter was volunteered to be on a panel for an open house Saturday morning. The last place she really felt like being at 9 a.m. was back on school campus. I mean, she loved school, but
Right.
She was eager to talk about her experiences and to answer any questions, but there weren't many questions at all. And that kind of, she took note of that. She's like, I got up really early on a Saturday morning, and I expected that the students, after the panel discussion was over, would raise their hand, and they didn't. And she noticed that. Again, and she didn't talk against any particular student with regards to that, but these things do not go unnoticed. So being able to come up with some really good questions does share that you're highly interested, right?
And I would also say that, again, it speaks to risk, that we're expecting that students are going to step outside their comfort zones in some way. And so certainly walking into a panel, it can be a bit nerve-wracking for a student who's new to the campus, and that may be part of the reason why they've chosen not to ask any questions. That being said, the opportunity to ask questions is important because it gives the student some sense of what kind of school community they're visiting and interested in being a part of. All of our school campuses are beautiful in the view books, and certainly people are friendly, but being on campus and asking questions, particularly asking the same question of multiple people to see if you get a consistent response, gives you a sense of whether or not that community is genuine or whether or not that's a community that is putting on a show while there are visitors there. So certainly, the introvert, and I can certainly understand that. I am an introvert by nature. It is very uncomfortable for me to be the first person to ask a question. At the same time, we hope that by the time a student finishes his or her 4 years here, that they will have gotten to a place where they have claimed their own voice and that they use it appropriately.
Yeah, awesome. So can you give me a question? Let's go back to the interview process. You're in front of a student. You're asking your questions. What type of questions do you expect that a student would or would not ask of you in the interview process? What's a good question? What's not a good question?
I will say that one question that has come up recently that I thought was a really interesting question was the student asked me how long I had been at the school and what And after I had answered and said that I'd been at the school 14 years, this is my 15th year, the student then asked me what were the reasons why I stayed. And I think that that's a really interesting question because my reasons for staying, my reasons for coming to the school to begin with, are reasons that could potentially be similar for the student.
Mhm.
So if a student senses in any way that I'm unhappy in my work or unhappy in my environment, then that certainly can have an impact as to whether or not they believe that community is the right one for them.
Mhm.
I would encourage students and parents to try to ask as many questions that go beyond the catalog. And what I mean by
Yes.
that is that the catalog provides a lot of information about class size, about course descriptions, about graduation requirements, perhaps even lists colleges that students have applied and matriculated in. And so, because those questions are already answered, then students and their parents should take advantage of having the admissions officer in front of them to ask questions that go a little bit deeper, that really speak to the school community.
Yeah, yeah, that's a waste of time to ask questions that are already answered on the website or in brochures, you know.
Mhm.
So going a little bit deeper makes a lot of sense. So, how should students best prepare for the interview?
The first thing I would say is get a good night's rest and make sure that you eat before the interview. There's nothing worse than being tired or hungry because it leads to distraction. It makes it very hard to focus on the questions that are being asked, and you combine that with nervousness, and it just doesn't make for a really good interview experience. So that's the first thing that I would say. I would also say being on time is so very important. And if you're going to be late, sometimes circumstances are beyond your control. As best you can, have someone call the office and mention that you'll be running a little bit late and perhaps give an estimate as to when you think you'll arrive. Because depending upon how tardy you're going to be, they may need to reschedule the appointment because oftentimes admissions offices are very busy.
Mhm.
That being said, I would also say coming prepared with questions to go back to the questions piece. Doing a little bit of research on the school to let the admissions officer know that not only are you willing to do the research, but that you're interested in the school, that you want to know what else the school has to offer, and that you've taken the time to prepare at least 2 to 3 questions.
Mhm.
And then the final thing I would say is paying very close attention to the way that you're dressed. The first impression cannot be redone.
That's right.
So certainly you want to show up dressed for success. So dressed for success means a lot of different things for different people. So I would say things like avoiding jeans, for example, or clothing that's too casual. Certainly making sure that your clothing is ironed. Those are all things that say that you pay attention to the details. And again, it goes beyond the interview because if you pay attention to the details for your interview, it lets us know that perhaps you pay attention to details in other areas.
Well, let's talk about this because I just want to let you know, I was simply referring to my notes to
Mm-hmm.
make sure I was, on point.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about the cell phone and parents. This might sound, folks, this might sound like, of course I wouldn't bring my phone in, but you'd be surprised, right?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. People are attached at the hip to their devices, and certainly, depending upon your career, you may need to have a little more access to your phone than would be considered "quote unquote" the norm.
Mhm.
That being said, it's important for people to be in the moment, to really think about what's happening in the process, and if a person is distracted, then it makes it really difficult to catch those things in the environment that perhaps they might not necessarily like. So making sure that you remember to turn off the ringer on the phone so that it's not, so that it doesn't pose an issue if the phone rings during the interview. The second piece to that is that if you're going to refer to your phone, then you should leave that only for example, if you've got questions on your phone that you want to ask, but checking email or checking text, you'd be surprised how many people do that. Those are things that are really inappropriate. And I would say that that doesn't just include being in the interview office, but that includes being on tour. That
Yeah.
if you want to take pictures of the campus, that's certainly I think okay. And certainly if you want to sort of take notes on your phone as to things that the tour guide mentions on the tour, that's perfectly fine. But I think that if you're talking on your phone and checking things that are not related to the visit, that really comes across as being disengaged from the process.
Mhm. So I'm sure you ask a lot of questions or refer to the academics piece, right?
Mhm.
But what about character development? I've been speaking with a lot of other um, admission professionals who said, it's just as important for us to determine the character of a student as it
Mhm.
is to know their number grades. So what type of questions do you ask to determine character development?
So often I'll go back to the personal values, personal and family values. What are those values that really most resonate with the student? Because that does speak to character. So things like trustworthiness, punctuality, organization. Those are the kinds of things that will give you a sense of where the student is coming from as it relates to their character journey, if you will.
Mhm.
Also, asking the student about their service experience. What kind of community service opportunities have they been a part of? And not just for the purpose of them naming all of the different kinds of activities they've been a part of, but getting them to sort of let us know what are the opportunities that they've been engaged in that most resonated with them. If you enjoy working with children, for example, what is the experience that you've had with children that really just made you glow on the inside because it really touched a part of that character piece in a way that perhaps people might not know. So certainly asking about those service opportunities. I would also say sometimes we'll ask about travel, whether it's overnight stays or domestic travel to visit family or international travel, and may ask them about those experiences. What were sort of the highlights of those experiences beyond food and architecture and so forth? Because again, how people relate to people that they don't know very well, or how they relate to their own family members, those also speak to character.
What about the resiliency piece? So resiliency is, you know, is really big in our conversations in our independent schools. How do you bounce back? How do you deal with disappointment? Is that something that you really want to get a hold of as well?
Oh, yeah. And I will talk often with students and with their parents about pressure, how they deal with self-imposed pressure and pressure that's imposed externally, because that does speak to resilience. So, how do you handle when a difficult concept that you just seem to can't wrap your mind around? How do you deal with a failed test? How do you deal with the loss of a game? How do you deal with perhaps some personal challenges that may come up that have an impact on your academic experience? Maybe the loss of a parent, which I've seen happen. Those kinds of things can be incredibly challenging for a student and difficult for them to come back from. But to speak to the resilience piece, that really has a lot to do with the student's ability to ask for help. There are lots of people in place on campus, from the advisor to peers to teachers to coaches, administrators. For us as a boarding school, they're dorm parents. So, really recognizing that there are lots of people who are willing and ready to help if they know that that's something that you need. So, being able to own your voice and say, you know what, I'm really struggling this week. I've got, 2 tests this week and I'm not feeling good. And I just really feel like I'm having a hard time pulling it all together. That's really important for a student to be able to bounce back without asking for help. Then the student really is relying upon him or herself to do it all alone, and that's not always they're not always going to meet with success in that way.
No, I'm glad that you mentioned that because it's about being authentic, and there's really no right or wrong in any of this. Particularly in the interview process, I'm sure you would agree. There's no right or wrong way to respond or answer, but it's about being authentic and being who you are. So when we talk about our students of color
Mhm.
going into this interview process, I'm sure it's intimidating on any level, regardless of your cultural or racial background. But as a student of color, walking onto these campuses, to these school settings, being in front of an administrator, what would you say to a student of color about bringing their cultural capital into the room with them, being authentic, coming in with their whole selves,
Mhm.
not trying to be anyone else other than who they are? And that's perfect enough.
Well, I think exactly what you just said. I think it's really important for them to recognize that the interview is not just us interviewing them, it's them interviewing us as well. And so if you don't feel that you can bring your full self even into the interview, then that may speak also to the inability to bring your full self to the campus once you have been provided the admissions letter. So really, again, I know that it's an uncomfortable position. It feels unnatural to walk into a room with a stranger and to talk about yourself and to feel like you can trust that you can bring your whole self to the interview. But certainly there are lots of ways to do that. If you've got a sense of humor, bring that into the interview. If you are interested in current events, bring that into the interview. I've had students who have brought up Black Lives Matter in an interview, and I think that that's really, it makes for a more interesting interview because it speaks to the ways in which the student might engage within the school. The ways in which the student might engage within the school community in the classroom, where perhaps those current events may not necessarily arise as a part of the discussion. For a student to say, "This is something that I'm interested in, and this is how I see it connecting to the topic at hand," it's not only beneficial to the student, but it's beneficial to the student's peers. It's beneficial to the teacher who is on his or her own learning journey. So walking in there and really owning who you are in that process is particularly important. And a side piece I would add to that is, and this doesn't just relate to students of color, but students who are coming seeking lots of financial aid, that sometimes they are intimidated to ask questions, particularly if it's a question that challenges what the school is saying about themselves. They feel they don't have the right to ask those questions. But you have every right to ask those questions, that families are making sacrifices to allow students to have these experiences. And so as a result, they should know exactly what they're getting into. So again, asking the questions, that's particularly important. And then I would ask one other thing, or say one other thing, which is oftentimes when I meet parents of color, they are reluctant to ask very many questions. They tend to say, well, I'm letting my daughter or my son really lead this process. And I think there is some independence related to letting your son or daughter lead the process. But at the same time, there are questions that parents will want to know. You may want to know about campus safety, for example. You may want to know how the school is going to support your child as a child of color. If there is a different religious background, or maybe your child has allergies or whatever it might be, these are questions that parents are more interested in asking than students. It doesn't mean that the students don't want to know, but that doesn't tend to rise to the front of their list of questions. So being willing to reach outside your own comfort zone as an advocate for your child is particularly important.
Yeah, and it's a good look too. Parents schools want, they're interviewing the whole family. So, and it's a partnership. So parents need to be able to articulate what's on their mind, ask the questions, and be able to get some feedback. So I'm really excited for our students, and I'm even excited that you'll have some RIISE students, RIISE family members coming to Tabor to interview. It's a beautiful campus, right by the sea, the campus right by the sea, and it's an amazing boarding school. And they have the benefit of having Anika Walker-Johnson there supporting the school, not only with multicultural education, but as well with reaching out and finding great students here to be a part of the legacy of Tabor Academy. So we'll be talking more to you. And thank you so much for stepping outside your comfort zone to join us to join us today to talk about the interview process. So everyone remember that we'll talk more about the interview process and more this Wednesday at Riverdale Country Schools. So please join us. Go on our website for RIISE, the number 4, RIISE.org, and sign up for the event. Anika, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, and good luck to you in your admissions process this year and finding some really great students.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Have a good day.
You too. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.